Hi everybody and welcome to the event. My name's Beth and I work in the communications team for RSPB England. We're really excited to be running the COP26 Youth Panel event where our brilliant host James Miller and also our other brilliant young panellists will be addressing the statement, "Climate change is on our leaders and not our youth to sort." So before we start, I just wanted to go through a little bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions or comments during this video, please can you pop them in the comments section on the video, or if you're watching in the Facebook event, please can you add them on the discussions tab. Your comments will be viewable by attendees of the event, but not actually in the recording. However, myself and my colleagues will be on hand to answer any questions throughout using the chat functions. We do ask that you be polite, kind and respectful as we don't tolerate any bullying or trolling. So without further ado, it's time to hand over to our fabulous host, James Miller. James is a 19-year-old environmental activist, filmmaker and presenter, currently studying natural sciences at Cambridge. He started making short films about climate and biodiversity at the age of 13. And since then, his efforts to put these issues on the political agenda have taken him everywhere from Channel 4 News to the inside of 10 Downing Street. In the last year, he's coordinated several initiatives of his own, including an online concert featuring Olivia Rodrigo to raise money for conservation and the installation of the Glasgow climate clock ahead of COP26. So for now, I'll hand over to James.
Cool, thanks so much, Beth. And hello, everyone. Thanks so much for having me here today and for tuning in. I hope this is going to be a really interesting and a really inspiring discussion, actually, between some great young people that we've assembled today for you. And all of this is happening in the context of COP26, which I'm sure you've heard of. It's the big UN climate summit that's happening in Glasgow right now, where more than 200 countries are gathering together to accelerate climate ambition for the next decade in particular. And we know that this is really important, right? We know we have a decade now to halve global annual emissions in order to keep 1.5 degrees of warming within sight. And that's really crucial if we want to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. But the problem is that so far countries really are not on the necessary plane of ambition that they need to be. A UN NDC synthesis report that was released earlier this year concluded that current country pledges would actually lead to a 16% increase in emissions by that date, and that would lead to a catastrophic 2.7 degrees temperature rise, far, far more than the 1.5 degrees that we need to keep below. And so this is something that world leaders are going to be trying to sort out in Glasgow, among a number of other slightly more technical details. And alongside all of that, young people all around the world will be gathering together in a concerted effort to get world leaders to step up their game and do what they need to do. And this is something that young people have been doing for the past few years, actually, in particular. The youth environmental movement has completely taken off since about 2018, when Greta Thunberg started her protests in Sweden. And it's not just the protests, though. It's been a lot of different fields and a lot of different fronts on which this battle is being fought by young people. There are youth groups who are taking governments to court as well, like there's a team of Portuguese climate activists who are taking 33 European countries to the Court of Human Rights and making those countries increase their ambition in terms of their NDCs, their climate commitments for 2030. And if they succeed, those countries will be compelled not only to increase their ambition, but also to deal with their international contribution to climate change as well, which is something that's never been done before, and that's really exciting. There's also court cases going on in Peru relating to deforestation of the Amazon. There's one going on in Australia relating to ministers' duty of care. And also, in addition to the acting on the legislation side of things, there's people in the US who have been working behind the scenes, I think, really. And those people are responsible for the huge level of climate ambition that Joe Biden has this year, in particular a movement called the Sunrise Movement, which was responsible for a lot of campaigning behind the US election that's really driven climate up the agenda in the last few years. There's such a huge list, I could go on, but at the moment, all us young people in all different spheres are turning our attention towards this climate summit in Glasgow. And I think young people are going to be involved in several capacities. At the event, there's going to be some young people doing marches on the 5th, November the 5th, this Friday, And there's going to be a wiser strike on the 6th as well, which will be of all generations all over the world, and we'll come back to that a bit later. There's also going to be young people staging events and actions at the summit itself inside the delegate space, which is really exciting. And young people are formally involved in the negotiations process itself through the UN's youth constituency called Youngo. And that allows us as young people to hold meetings with the negotiators and with the politicians at the event, and to actually formally have our voices heard, even though we can't make those decisions ourselves. So COP26 is happening at the moment. It's a hugely important event, and young people are right at the heart of it. And that's the context for the discussion that we're having here today. The 5 of us, me and a lineup of 4 incredible young panelists who I would love to introduce to you all. The first of them is Indy Greene, who is a 16-year-old naturalist from Nottinghamshire, who's currently studying countryside management at college. And I think nature has always been a huge part of his life, but now he's lucky enough to live in Sherwood Forest, where he gets to experience, I think, some of the best of British wildlife that he's constantly sharing through his social media and making the rest of us very jealous indeed. The next is Maya Bambrick, our second panelist, and she is a 19-year-old naturalist, birder, vlogger and environmentalist. She's also had a passion for the natural world from a very, very early age, and she's always spending her time out in the field doing bird ringing, doing vlogging and some incredible wildlife photography as well, which she also shares over her social media. We'll share all these social media links later, and you can follow all these guys and what they're doing. She's also an ambassador for the Cameron Bespoker Trust and a council member for the Sussex Ornithological Society. Next up, we have Darwa Koreshi, who's a wildlife filmmaker, freelance journalist, a researcher at the BBC Natural History Unit, and a marine biologist. They have a passion for wildlife and conservation, as well as speaking about topics such as diversity and political issues, which of course are also really, really important. And they're also a really passionate storyteller, and like me, I think, believe that it's a really, really powerful tool of communication that can be used to change the world. And again, this is something we're going to come back to a bit later, I think. And last, but certainly not least, we have Izzy Fry, who is a 16-year-old naturalist, aspiring wildlife conservationist, blogger and bird ringer from Wiltshire. She's written articles for the RSPB, for butterfly conservation and plant life, and many others. And she's also an ambassador for Wiltshire Wildlife Trust. And like all of our panelists as well, she's also great at using social media and has some amazing wildlife photography that she uses to engage people with nature and with conservation. So that's the panelists, that's the lineup. Thanks so much, guys, for joining me here today. It's great to see you. It's been a while, actually, since I've spoken to many of you. And for some of you, it's the first time I've spoken to you at all. So it's great to have this opportunity to meet you all and hear all of your perspectives. I know that actually an hour isn't very long to have a panel of 4 people, and I've already been speaking quite a lot. So I'm going to dive straight in, if that's okay, with our first point of discussion, which I think is quite a philosophical one. It's why are we here today? Why do you think that youth voices have been at the forefront of the nature and climate emergency? And I think I'd like to kick off with Indy. Do you have any thoughts on this, Indy?
I do. Thank you very much for having me, guys. So I think it's really important to our generation in particular for many reasons. I suppose mostly because it's our future, and we're going to have to be surviving in the conditions that are getting incredibly, even they're getting worse every single second. So that's mostly because it's our future. It's also because it really matters. And it's our planet. It's not like sorting out the car park at the local convenience store. It's the planet. It's the most important thing in the world, because it's the world. So I think that's definitely why we definitely care so much. But I think our voices are being heard so much more recently because of the new dawn of social media. And this is something my dad actually brought to my attention, because I said to him, why do you think, because I wanted to get different perspectives on this. I said, why do you think it's just always seen as young people at the forefront of this? And he said, because you're the one shouting the loudest about it, because you've got this amazing tool at our fingertips, which is social media. So I think that's definitely given us a platform to really just shout about everything that we care about and trying to create some change at the same time. So I think it's definitely because it's our future, because it matters, and social media has given us the platform to do so.
100%. Yeah, we're so much more interconnected than previous generations, and that's really something I think we should. It's brought some negative impacts, but on the whole, I think it's been hugely positive, given the challenges that we face and the level of coordination that it's allowed us to have in terms of having these strikes all across the world happening in exactly the same time and bringing millions of people onto the streets at the.
Oh, James, I think you're muted.
Oh, sorry, I don't know how that happened. I don't know how much of that you missed. But
2 seconds.
2 seconds, 2 seconds. Okay. But for the Earth Day protest that they used to have decades ago, they actually used to have to go out and post through people's letterboxes notices that these strikes were happening in order to get people out. So definitely a huge contributor, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah. How about you, Dawood? What do you reckon?
I think I'd probably add a slightly more controversial element to that, in that, you know, people are kind of fed up. And I think, you know, a big part of the youth outcry at the moment is that anger and that sort of that passionate outburst, and that, you know, that sort of fighting back against all of these powers that seem to be telling us that they're going to do something and then never doing anything. And I think a very good example of some of that is some of the sort of more controversial elements of COP and what it has shown so far in terms of who's been speaking, who's funding it, and the people who are actually at it. And, you know, for me, sort of looking at the whole sort of system and how it works and COP and, you know, all the people going there, I know people who are going to it who are amazing people, who are amazing speakers. They're speaking about change, they're speaking about representation, about perspectives that need, you know, that need changing in the future. And these are incredible people with voices that need to be heard. But you've got this event which I don't think really has catered to them in the correct way. It's become quite inaccessible for a lot of young people in terms of who can speak at it. It's quite expensive to get there. There's lots of large organizations that we didn't really want speaking there who seem to have shown themselves and are being represented there in the wrong light. And I think that's sort of a prime example of adults, as it were, you know, quote unquote adults, telling younger people to sit down and wait until it's our time to say something, and saying that, you know, we'll deal with it, we'll get on with it, we'll change it, and then really not only not doing anything about it, but going the opposite way and actually creating even a larger debt to the planet than we already have. And so I think that, you know, it's that outcry and that outburst of energy that we've got, and we've seen that with recent political advancements, recent people who've got into parliament, younger people who have got more to say about these issues to do with the environment, to do with diversity, more journalists who are younger people, more scientists who are younger people, and more people who are going into these areas of natural science and environmental conservation and, you know, talking about it and shouting about it. And just as Indy said, social media has really allowed them to use that energy and that anger and channel it into something that they can actually talk about globally and tell other young people, and everyone links up with those ideas and that energy. And I think that is why we're seeing more of it now. And, you know, whilst I would champion it and say that it is a good thing, it's quite a sad thing as well, because it is, you know, it's something that seems to almost be a desperate cry now, because we're almost holding on to the dregs of it and trying to do something desperately because it's taken so long for past generations to sort of sit up and do something. And I hope that this, you know, this will be our chance to do something about it finally.
I really hope so as well. And I totally hear everything you say about COP and all its problems. We know this is one of the most unequal COPs that's happened to date, partly because of COVID-19 has exacerbated those pre-existing issues. And it would just be great, I think, if we could have more young people in those decision-making seats themselves at these negotiations. There's this one young lady called Marie Claire, who actually represented Switzerland at the last series of negotiations at the age of 23, and she led discussions on adaptations and resilience in developing countries for Switzerland. And I thought that was incredible, but she's just one person out of so many negotiators, and youth representation at these events in the actual decision-making seats is pretty appalling. So I really hope that's something that will start to change in future COPs, but we'll have to see. Yeah, how about you, Maya? Why do you think that young people are right at the forefront of this?
Yeah, I think it's because obviously we're going to be impacted the most. So as well as ourselves, our children, our grandchildren, this is the breaking point of what the next 50 to 100 years are going to look like and what our future looks like. And as well as that, we can see it right in front of our eyes with all the extreme weather events going on across the world. And as well, sort of nature-wise, I'm sure all of us have heard stories from our older family members of how much nature there was years ago, and we can see it disappear right in front of our eyes, which is really sad, I think. And all the species that are sort of going extinct and are very vulnerable to extinction because of climate change. I think that's largely an issue that's not raised enough, of how the biodiversity crisis and the climate change crisis is very linked. So I think us young people, we can see it happening, and we can see obviously the next 50 years is really going to sort of determine what happens and what our futures look like.
Absolutely, yeah, no, we do have the greatest stake, I think, in the future of anyone, along with the people living in the most affected areas around the world. And it's definitely something that I think gives us a right to be more vocal and more angry about it than most. How about you, Izzy? What do you think?
Yeah, so I think I agree with Maya. We will face the worst effects, but also we've been taught it from a young age. We've heard about climate change, whereas the older generations, it's a new thing, it's a recent thing in their lives. And so I think they don't take it as serious, and it's not going to affect them as much as us. And I mean, I'm 16 and this issue has been around all of my life. And I think that's why it's at the forefront of my mind. And just worrying about what our future is going to look like.
I'm very sorry, I just missed the last bit of that because the internet froze. But I'm assuming, sorry, you finished answering, have you?
Yeah.
Fantastic. No, I totally agree that this is something that we've been taught about from a really young age, actually, unlike a lot of older people. Climate change has been in the curriculum a little bit, perhaps not as much as we would like it to be, but that's been enough to turn many people in our generation onto the issue when older ones weren't. And this is actually something that I like to bring us on for the next question, which is all about eco-anxiety. We know that a study was performed by the government a few weeks ago, and it concluded that more than 60% of young people are feeling some form of eco-anxiety, are feeling worried about what's going to happen to the planet and to their futures. And I think this is something that we can probably all sympathise with here on this panel. I just wondered if any of you had any coping strategies, maybe is the word I'm looking for, any ways of managing that eco-anxiety or turning it into something more productive or positive. And should we go the other way around this time? I'll start with you, Izzy.
Yeah, so when I think of eco-anxiety, I think of stress and anxiety caused by worries of what the future is going to look like, and what's going to happen with climate change. And I think some good ways to manage that is turning that anxious energy into positive action by doing small things, like thinking globally but acting locally, doing small things in your day-to-day lives to feel like you're doing your bit.
100%, yeah. And I think often it can actually be so much more rewarding acting on a local level because you can see the changes that you're making on a day-to-day basis, whereas sometimes when you're lobbying against national or global policy changes, if something happens, you don't know whether or not you actually contributed to that meaningfully, and very often it doesn't happen and it just feels like you're fighting an uphill battle. But when you're working on something local and you can actually see the changes you're making, that can make a huge difference. Yeah. How about you, Maya? What's your strategy?
Yeah, so I think all of us sort of feel a responsibility as such to make a change, but I think it's important to accept when you do have eco-anxiety and to accept those worries that you have. But I think you need to make sure you look after your mental health at the same time. So to sort of cope with that eco-anxiety, to make small changes that you know you can do, and not to feel too much like you need to change the world, because that's not going to be good for anyone's mental health, to feel all that responsibility on one person. So I think as well, as well as making those sort of small changes, such as sort of eating maybe less meat or using more public transport, simple things that can make a lot of difference. I think it's important to sort of surround yourself with people that are as passionate as you about environmental issues, so you can really sort of discuss and feel like you can talk about your eco-anxiety, because you don't want it to all build up. So I think it's important to surround yourself with people, like-minded people, who you can sort of share your worries with.
Yeah, totally. And I think in that respect, it's like any other problems you might have in life, in that sharing them with someone so often helps. Yeah, definitely. How about you, Dawood?
I think this is quite an interesting question, and it keeps getting asked. And I think for me, there's sort of two elements to it that we kind of need to tackle, and that's about control and about hope. So when young people, a lot of young people get eco anxiety, and we get stressed about the future, and we get stressed about the things that are happening in the world, it is because you see these things around the world, and you kind of lose hope that the future will be different just because of past experiences that you've had, conversations you've had with people who are perhaps older than you and may have experienced similar issues, and change that you see that is happening very slowly in the world. And so I think a key element of sort of getting rid of that eco anxiety is getting a bit of hope and understanding that we can change the future, and that comes from an understanding that we control the future. And I think control comes mainly from understanding that we can own that premise. We can own the premise to the questions that are going to be asked at these giant events. We can own sort of the premise of the questions that are going to be asked by world leaders to us, because when they ask us questions, they're controlling the room. They're controlling all of these elements that they're talking about. They're controlling their idea of sustainability, environmental protection, conservation. And if we understand that actually, as young people with lots of energy and lots of strength and lots of anger almost that can be turned into a positive thing, we can take those questions and we can ask our own questions based on the experiences that we've had as young people living in an environment that we're going to grow up in. And just like the others have said, we're going to grow up in that environment. We're going to face most of those challenges. So by understanding what we're facing, we then have ultimately more experience than they do. We then have more of a stake in it than they do. So therefore, surely shouldn't we be the ones asking the questions, and we should be the ones owning that narrative? And when you kind of understand that, then you understand that actually we're the ones in control of this premise, and that gives you more hope, I think, because it allows you to believe that we can actually change this future for the better.
Definitely. I'm a huge believer in that young people have the capacity to change the world, like with some of those examples that I mentioned earlier. And that's something that gives me a huge source of optimism, actually. No matter what happens at this COP, we don't know the results that are going to come out of it. And actually, when they do come out, it's going to be quite difficult to navigate. It's not going to be easy to tell whether it's been a success or not. But I think the actions that young people are taking all around the world is just something that keeps me going. And I'm sure it's the same with all of you guys. How about you, Indy?
Well, firstly, I just want to pick up on something Izzy said, which I thought was brilliant, which was, I wrote it down, thinking globally but acting locally. I love that, because every Tuesday, and I was out today, I volunteered with the RSPB in Sherwood Forest, and that's basically to enhance the habitat and make it better for every bird and bug bee you could think of in a heathland or woodland habitat. And it's my favourite thing in the week. And I just love how like fulfilling that is, and how like satisfying it is to actually get out there doing hands-on stuff. And I'm sure we've all done hands-on stuff, and I'm sure you all know how flipping satisfying it is, because it's the best thing in the world. But yes, that thinking globally but acting, and sort of in a respective way locally, which I think is really good. But I suppose tips on how to cope with eco-anxiety, because I definitely suffer with it. I think a lot of us obviously do. I usually say, like, try and go outside and have like good nature experiences, which occasionally could definitely, I know, speaking from personal experiences, definitely cheered me up in a lot of cases. But then sometimes you can go outside and look at a habitat and think, oh, that's wrong with it, that's wrong with it. And you can just almost, it can almost ruin your day even more if you go outside, because sometimes you can just see how destroyed some, littering, just anything that's damaging to the environment, it can just sort of go, oh, I came out here to sort of escape all of this, and now I'm just seeing even more devastation, which can sometimes be and sometimes isn't. But I definitely think that one of the most important things, I think you mentioned, James, is just talking to people and just seeing how other people feel. And of course, everything else that everybody's already said. But I think I've got a few friends that I talk to about it regularly, and it really does help to, like I've been on phones to friends like shouting about it before, and it's just afterwards you just feel, okay, even though we're no close to solving anything, I've got that off my chest, and I know that has made me feel a lot better in the past.
A burden shared is a burden halved. Yeah,
yes,
definitely. And actually, that's what you said about going outside and sometimes feeling a bit worse because you can see how ecologically damaged a landscape is. That's something that I'm sure has happened to me subconsciously, but I've never really put it into words like that. So that's something I really connected with, actually, and something I'll think about a lot more. But yeah, nevertheless, getting outside can help as well, I feel. Doing exercise, this probably isn't the right thing to suggest, but eating chocolate and listening to Jason Mraz, I quite enjoy that. But yes, okay, moving on. I think the next question is looking ahead to something a little more optimistic as well, or not, as the case may be, we'll have to see. But if you could pick one positive action to come out of COP26, if there's one thing you're looking to this summit to provide, what would it be? And we'll kick off with you, Indy, again, go back round the other way.
Nice one. I mean, it's so easy to just sit back and go, action, please. Which is definitely what I want. I definitely want some action. I'm sure we all do, because we're about 50 years due some action. But I suppose one thing, I was trying to think of something obscure because I know other people will probably say what I was thinking originally, but what I would like is for people to recognise the countries that'll be affected by this first, in terms of like definitely, it's as always with so many things, even like the vaccine rollout, it's the poorer countries that haven't had as much accessibility to it, and it's the same with climate change in terms of they're being affected by it first because they're poorer and they can't necessarily put measures in place to stop flooding or stop all the destruction that's happening. So I think definitely it's time to recognise that that's happening, because you never really hear about that. If ever on the news, if ever there's some sort of natural disaster, you only hear about it from a rich country's perspective. If something happens in a poorer country that's further away, we don't generally, unless it's really serious, we don't really hear about it. So I think we definitely need to just highlight the plight that people are already in, because people still think somehow that climate change is still going to affect people in the future, but it's not, it's now. And I think we need to show a bit more of that, because that could entice even more action out of people. Other than that, definitely holding people to account. And if all else fails, we are way due some action. So definitely some action.
100%. And totally agree with you there, actually, that we can sometimes have a selection bias in what we hear, especially through the media, very Eurocentric, and what's also being platformed at COP26 as well. It's quite difficult for developing countries and people in the global south to have their voices heard.
Yeah.
But actually, maybe one of the reasons that young people are so connected to this is because of social media. We're so much closer to people on the other side of the world and to impacts that are being felt on the other side of the planet than our parents are and other generations. And maybe that's part of our duty, is to bring that connection to everyone else and use, I think, our moral authority and the kind of, I would say, a trust actually that's being placed in us as well by all the generations, far more so than in governments and in institutions, to bring that message forward and share it with everyone else as well. Yeah. How about you, Dawood? What do you reckon?
I mean, first I want to say how good that point was that Indy made, and how much, that is something that I really hope is brought more to the forefront, is the fact that there are so many underrepresented people who are affected by these changes far more than what we are shown, and who are even represented at COP. And we need to really understand that it's almost a duty that we have, because the countries that cause most of the climate change issues are the countries that aren't affected as much by those same issues that they cause. And for me, it is almost it almost becomes personal. You know, I've got family and friends in a lot of those countries that have been affected quite badly by these issues, and I feel quite grateful on one side to live in a country that isn't affected quite badly by these issues, but on the other hand feel, you know, a bit guilty because I'm in a place of privilege almost. And you know, it is a place where you sort of think that, oh, I'm in a country that's causing a lot of these issues, I should probably do something about it. And that's, I think, a big message that needs to come out of COP. So I think, you know, I need to thank Indy for saying that, and bringing that up. It is a very important point. We need to understand that there are a lot of people around the world that don't have the privilege of speaking up about these issues, but are affected by them mostly. But I'd say one of the main things I want to come out of COP is young people understanding that we don't need permission to start changing things. We don't need that permission. You know, there are people coming up there are world leaders who are talking at these things, at these summits, and there are lots and lots of, I'm going to use the word adults again, even though, you know, some of us are actually technically adults, but most of us, in fact, all of us are, I think. But the sort of stereotypical older person who will be speaking at those events, and a lot of people seem to be waiting for them to do something, and then, you know, and then we can do something, and then we can roll out changes. But as we've seen around the globe and around the country, young people don't need permission to start doing things. We don't need their permission. And actually, for me, what's more interesting, the events that are more almost interesting and passionate to me and closer to my heart, are the marches and the protests and the panels that the young people are going to be on at those events, where they're going to be speaking their minds, speaking their opinions, and talking about what they want to change in the future. Those are far more interesting to me because they show that young people, you know, we don't need permission to start. We can start now. We've started before. We can take this change to the next level, and we don't need these people in these positions to tell us to start.
No, definitely. I think that's one of the big messages that Greta and Fridays for Future are trying to push at this summit, because we don't know how optimistic it's going to look after the end result, but we need people not to lose hope and to realize that they actually have a lot of power in and of themselves to make these changes. And I think that if we can use COP26 actually as a mass communications tool to push out these voices of young people who are already doing such amazing things on every corner of the globe, then that would actually be a really great outcome to have from COP, if we could share that. How about you, Maya? What would you like to see come out of the summit?
Yeah, I think I'd like to see sort of leaders and those in higher places to sort of take this climate crisis as much as an emergency as COVID is and was. So if you see how the world and countries pulled together when COVID came about, and how quickly we came up with a vaccine, and how all that everyone worked together to make it the world a better place. I think if we did that for climate crisis and biodiversity crisis, things would look a lot differently. As well as that, I think leaders need to set an example. So we saw Boris Johnson took the private jet to the G7 summit in Cornwall. So I think the public are not going to take leaders seriously if they're doing things like that. And you can sort of tell that it's just a word, it's not going to be actioned. So I think sort of leaders and those in higher places need to sort of set an example for the public, for those to make changes as well, so we can all work together and make a difference.
Definitely. It would be really nice to see a genuine change in mindset from a lot of politicians gathered at the summit today, but I don't know how likely that is. We'll have to see. Slow change, slow progress. We'll get there one day. And how about you, Izzy?
Yeah, I think I would like to see the UK come away acting locally by reaching our targets, but also, as we are a powerful country and we have a lot of influence, I would love them to inspire other countries and other nations to act as well. And like Maya said, setting a good example, not only to our people, but also other nations and other countries as well.
Definitely. We really should be leading the way. And I think my personal opinion is that we've set pretty ambitious targets. They could be better. I'd have liked them to have been better, but relative to other countries, they're pretty good. But in terms of meeting them, bringing forward plans, credible plans and funding to meet them, we are doing a pretty bad job. And also with all the infrastructure projects and coal mines that are being opened, and as you mentioned, of course, the private jets. Yeah, I think we could be conveying a far better message to the rest of the world at this really important summit.
Yeah.
But we will see. We will see. I'll reserve judgment until 2 weeks' time. Right, I think that's the end of it for my questions, but now we're going to move on to some questions from the audience, which I have gathered here. And these are going to be, I think, directed to you as individuals, otherwise we'll probably take a little too much time. So I'll direct them at whoever I think they're best suited to. I'll start off with one for Indy, which is, Indy, do you think it's fair that so much pressure is being put on youth to address the nature and the climate emergency? Do you think that's right?
No. I think that, I mean, it's really difficult because throughout this, the government has treated the climate crisis and the biological crisis like homework. They've just left everything to the last minute. Not me. I never do that. I hope I teach this. But I think what is important to note is that it's not entirely young people. I think it's because people often brand it as like, oh yeah, the young people are sort of pushing this, and which, as a general, I suppose this is again coming back to social media again. It's sort of, it would seem that way because we're, you know, tech snazzy or whatever. I'm not tech snazzy. I can't barely say it. So I think that's what people, that's the impression that people get, is that young people are at the forefront of this. But it is definitely important to note that it isn't just, I meet so many people who are older than me, who are also extremely passionate, who I look up to, my line managers, everybody in the RSPB, everybody I know is, I'm not friends with anyone if they don't like nature, that's it. So everybody I know, from, you know, young to old, does really care about this. So I think it's important to know that it isn't just young people, but like you said, I don't think it is fair that all that pressure is put on us, because for so long it's been branded as something that young people will solve. But of course, that's hopefully, I see that being corrected a lot in terms of, well, no, actually, by the time we get to power, they will be too late anyway. And I see that being corrected a lot recently, which is really good. And I think that it isn't fair that so much pressure is put on us young people, because when you're kids, all you want to do is have fun. You don't want to have the burden of the burning planet on your shoulders the entire time. I would rather, no offense, not be here. I'd rather be sat on my sofa watching a film, stuffing popcorn in my face. I'm sure many of us will. None of us should have to do this because we're kids. We should be having fun and enjoying and just watching our leaders be leaders and not literally failing. So yeah, no, I don't think it's fair. But all we can do is keep using our voices and just keep giving our leaders as much information, because in terms of a lot of things, we seem to be a lot more switched on than them. So yeah, no, it's not fair, but hopefully we can support people to come to better, you know, hopefully create a better outcome.
Definitely. I totally sympathize with what you were saying as well, with it not being just young people. And sometimes it's so easy to forget that. But I gave a talk a week or so ago, and afterwards this man in his 80s came up and tapped me on the shoulder and said, don't forget about us grandparents either. We care about our grandchildren. And you can see there are a lot of older people actually on those Extinction Rebellion protests getting arrested, and laying down their freedom for younger generations, which is, I think, equally inspiring to see. And it would be great if actually at some point we could seek to make our movement more intergenerational and do more collaboration with older people as well, because I think that would be a really beautiful thing to see. That would be really powerful. Absolutely. Next question. Bearing that in mind, Maya, the fact that so much pressure is being placed on young people, do you think that we are being trained enough to deal with that pressure? Is there enough education on climate change in the curriculum? Is this something we need more of?
No, well, personally, I don't think there is. So I've gone through obviously primary, secondary, sixth form, and I don't really remember being taught about climate change or many environmental issues. Bearing in mind, I studied geography at A level as well. So no, I don't think there's enough that sort of education within the curriculum. I understand that the curriculum is very packed. There's a lot of things that I believe we should be taught which isn't, but I think at least I always thought that we could have a couple of days in the academic year where we are taught about environmental issues. It hasn't got to be a lesson a week, just at least some sort of education so we can go out there with knowledge behind us, and as well as that, sort of be unbiased, so to be taught the actual science of it rather than just teacher's opinion, which I've sort of experienced a couple of times. So I think you need to be able to know about something to care about it. So if young people don't know about the state of the world at the moment, they're not going to feel like they need to take any action and change in their lives. So I think there's a lot that needs to be changed within the curriculum. Whether that's going to be done in time, I'm not sure. But yeah, I think something needs to happen.
Yeah, no, definitely. And interestingly, actually, on that point, there's going to be an education ministers summit at COP26 itself, where education ministers, hopefully, we expect, are going to bring forward new pledges relating to climate education. And that's being led by the British and the Italian governments, who are in turn going to be announcing their own pledges as well. I think the Italian government is going to have one session a week, one lesson a week of compulsory climate education for all students, which is quite exciting. But totally agree with you there. Yeah, it needs to be more. It needs to be more at the moment. Next up, actually, something changing tack a little bit. Going to you, Dawood. There's a question here, which is enough being done to represent different young voices in the climate movement? And is there anything that we can do to improve this? I know this is something that you're really passionate about and speak a lot about, so it'd be great to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this is something I think that is incredibly important, especially when you're talking about the environment, especially when you're talking about the climate, and especially when you're talking about the future. So to answer the question, I don't think there's enough representation at all for a lot of different young people. And that basically, I think, comes from the education system. And it comes also from how things are represented in the media. So I talk a lot about representation. And I think representation is so incredibly important, especially when you're teaching young people what to be interested in and what to be passionate about. Because for me, I think, and I draw a lot of my own personal experience for this, sort of growing up as someone who couldn't see anyone who was a person of color, or anyone who, you know, wasn't at basically the stereotypical norm for a natural history presenter, or someone who was interested in science or conservation on TV or in books and that sort of thing. I couldn't see anyone who I could look up to, or I could see as sort of, you know, wanting to be in their shoes in the future. I couldn't see anyone who would teach me how to get there. And so as a young kid, I never thought that I could ever get to a place where I could be at a summit like this, or I could ever, you know, even get a job in the natural history unit. I never get to that place where I'd be able to talk about my interests in the natural world, because I was absolutely so passionate about the natural world as a kid. I'd collect bugs wherever I went, and bugs are basically, they're my big thing, like goshawks are indies. It's something that was so amazingly such a passionate subject for me, but I could never see myself in that position to talk about that and to study that even. And so I think the problem with underrepresented people, and especially young kids in today's climate, not to use that word too lightly, but in today's arena, if you like, is just that. It's underrepresentation, and it's the fact that it's a downward spiral, and it leads to its own failure. Because if you can't see yourself represented in a particular job or a particular passion, you're not really going to see yourself as succeeding in that future or in that passion, and therefore you don't go into it, and then there's less representation, and it just leads to its own spiral. So what I think needs to change is representation. You need to show people that they can be in these areas, they can be in these talks, they can be in these boardroom meetings where they can discuss their opinions and talk about their experiences. Because if you think about it logically, they should be there. You know, we were talking about before about how, the poorest countries and countries that aren't Eurocentric or aren't in the Western Hemisphere of the world are countries that are the climate change affects more negatively. And if you have people from those areas who can't speak about the very issues that are affecting them, we're not really going to get anywhere, because it's almost like we're talking in our own bubble and the opinions are just sort of bouncing around and no one's really getting anywhere. So you need to talk to people who have had those experiences. So I think a change in communication, talking to people who have different experiences to us, because I think different perspectives are the future. That's how you get change, is by exploring other areas of thought, because then you can understand how to do things in a different way, because obviously the old ways haven't been working very well. So we need different people with different perspectives anyway. So I think a change in communication, a change in representation, definitely, so people can see themselves, in the media, in wildlife jobs, and that sort of thing. I talked to Maya a while back, and I'm sure everyone knows about Maya. And she talked about the fact that she never saw women or people of color or that sort of thing when she was young and was working in a voluntary sort of status in reserves and walking around. And for me, it was a very similar thing. So I think there is a big issue. It's going to take us a while to get there, but I think the key factors we have to look at is representation and talking to people who have had different experiences than our own.
Definitely. I think, yeah, diversity is so important for so many reasons, and just as you mentioned, it's for bringing in new audiences and engaging a much wider platform of people with these issues. It's for understanding other perspectives so that you can create a vision for the future that works for everyone and that will gain more support and actually come into fruition, rather than meeting opposition and just crumbling under that. And also, I think also from the perspective of storytelling, of course, which you're really into as well, it's most interesting as well. It gets boring if you're just hearing the same kinds of voices, the same perspectives again and again. Whereas if you're hearing from a variety of voices, that's what makes it novel. That's what makes it interesting, and that's what engages people. So yeah, I really hope that's a change that we will see come into place quite rapidly over the next few years on all different fields. But especially in the role of climate change and the biodiversity crisis as well. Izzy, I have a question for you, and I think this is probably going to be our last question from the audience. We've spoken about how educational institutions can help support young people in terms of climate education, but do you think there's ways in which parents can better inspire and support their children to help to save nature and the climate?
Yeah, so I think everyone looks up to their parents. We learn from them, we copy what they do. Our upbringing really influences what we go on to do, our beliefs, what we think. And so I think parents should be setting like a good example, doing little things like recycling, bigger things like having electric cars, but also getting their children outside. A lot of people can't get outside and don't get outside as much as they should. So parents should really be pushing for children to get off their screens, go outside, go on walks, which in the future will encourage a love for nature and wildlife in more young people, who will then go on to want to protect and conserve wildlife and nature and really work for reversing climate change.
Definitely. Combating nature deficit disorder, as it's called sometimes, yeah. And I think that's something that's actually a significant goal of the RSPB, and what I'm sure several of you have been trying to do through your social media and also some of your volunteering work, trying to engage more young people with nature at an early age, so that they'll come through and replace all of you when you guys have moved up into the world of work, and we need more young advocates fighting from the outside as well. So I think that is actually probably as much as we have time for questions from the audience. I might wrap up. I hope you guys don't mind. I'm going to fire you with something that might be a little unexpected, just to wrap up. But I'd be really interested to hear about whether any of you guys have plans over the coming weeks or months, or even what you'd like to do with your career in your futures. Is there anything interesting that you guys have coming up? I know a lot of you have school and university, and that takes a huge amount of time. And that's my answer, basically. So. But yeah, how about you, Izzy? Should we start off with you?
Yeah, so I really want to go on to study wildlife conservation at uni. And I'm not really sure what career or job from there, but just something where I'm not in an office all day, something outside and practical, and yeah, but it's definitely something with wildlife conservation.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, that's probably, I think, not only a really rewarding way to live, but also probably a very healthy way to live as well. I don't know how much we're meant to be cooped up inside in offices all day. I know I've been feeling it just being at uni and studying in a desk all day, but definitely. How about you, Maya? What are you thinking?
So I'm currently, I've just started my first year of an ecology and wildlife conservation degree at Bournemouth University. So I'm really enjoying that, going on lots of field trips, seeing lots of great wildlife, especially down the Dorset coast. It's a great place to be. But in the future, my dream sort of job would be a wildlife TV presenter. So I sort of love, as well as I love being out in the field, and I love also the engagement side of it. So social media, doing the little vlogs that I do. I really sort of like those sort of two things. So I like to combine them if I can. So to really be able to engage the next generation to do what we're doing and getting the word out about the natural world and the climate crisis.
Definitely. Well, you've made a great start, actually. I think, yeah, your social media presence so far and making those vlogs is something that's really going to help you in future moving down those paths. So well done.
Thank you.
How about you, Dawood?
I feel kind of like kind of weird about this because usually I'm the youngest on on every panel, and now I'm the oldest. So I've already graduated university about 2-3 months ago, and obviously I did marine biology, and that was an absolutely fascinating course. Good, slightly marred at the end by COVID, which kind of ruined everything because it is a practical course, and I didn't really get to do much practical work at the end. But I think for me, especially with the sort of myriad of stuff that I do in terms of journalism, writing for different magazines and blogs, and as a researcher at BBC Natural History Unit, my idea of my future would be to continue with wildlife filmmaking, to make and produce, direct and write wildlife films, and continue to be a journalist, and hopefully get to a point where I can sort of start my own magazine and paper around issues that sort of have a core element of political agenda mixed with conservation and diversity, but also I think the interests of people nowadays that links into film, popular culture, and the things that allow people to subscribe to these views about conservation and climate change without actually having grown up with it and being interested in it from a very young age. Because I think, I'm almost quite privileged, in fact, that I grew up loving nature from such a young age, but a lot of people don't have that. So I think in order to reach out to them, what we have to do is to subscribe to almost their point of thinking in a way, and allow them to be interested in it naturally and organically. So I think for me it is, it's about that engagement and that communication. I love doing it. I love talking, probably too much. And I love writing. I think writing and storytelling, like you said, has been core to everything that I do. So I would hope to be in the future a writer, a storyteller, a filmmaker, and continue with that career, if you like, and and make films and travel and explore, but at the same time exploring my own sort of stories and the things that I've learned along the way, and hoping that other people can relate to them.
Very cool. And hopefully, your job at the BBC Natural History Unit will give you a helpful kickstart with that as well. I know those aren't easy to get, so congratulations on that. And hopefully that will take you some way as well to addressing those diversity and representation issues that you really care about as well. How about you, Indy? What do you have planned?
Oh, lots of plans. So yes, like James said earlier, I'm currently on a countryside management course at Brackenhurst College, not too far from me, which is a 2-year course, and I'm about 7 weeks into it. I go back tomorrow, which I'm absolutely loving. I'm so happy to be finally learning about something I want to learn about. So that's absolutely super. when I've done that, I would really, really, really love to move north to preferably the Outer Hebrides or the Cairngorm, somewhere like that. Because I spend a lot of time there. Hopefully, going to spend the winter on the Isle of Mull again, which would be really, really good fun. So I've got a really, really great friends group up there. Lots of really good contacts. Hopefully, set me up with some good stuff because I just love that part of the world and I love the wilderness of it and the peace and quiet because I don't like loud stuff. But I just need to work out I can take the goshawks with me. But yeah, definitely something up north, maybe in the Hebrides, but definitely something again, just something practical, a bit like Izzy, just anything outdoors, just anything hands-on outdoor stuff I will absolutely take.
Absolutely fantastic. I was going to say, at last, we're going to hear the end of those goshawks.
You'll never hear the end of the goshawks. I've still got that down posted. Yeah, they'll be out.
I need to escape one day. One day. Right, I think I'm afraid, everyone, that's about all we have time for. So thanks so much, panelists, for joining. It was amazing to speak to all of you and hear all of your perspectives. And I know I definitely found that a really interesting and really inspiring discussion. And I hope the people back home did as well, all of you tuning in. Do remember, for those of you tuning in as well, that it is the Global Day of Action coming up on the 6th, this Saturday. There will be people marching all over the globe. I'll be in Glasgow. But there'll be loads of different marches going on all over the country and all over the world. I think the Fridays for Future website is probably the best place to go for that, to see where your local strike's happening. And we'll put some links up under the Facebook Live as well, so that you can check those out and see where your nearest one is. That would be really great. And also do keep up to date as well with what's happening at COP26 and share them with your community, and also maybe use this as an opportunity to influence as well the institutions that you work with, maybe your businesses or your educational establishments, and get them talking about climate change. I think that as well as being a really important series of political negotiations, it's an opportunity to get everyone engaged with this issue and put loads of pressure on corporations, on businesses and on educational establishments like many of us are in, to do better when it comes to climate change and nature. But yeah, that's all I have to say for today. Please do follow our panelists on social media. We'll put links to their social media under the post as well, so that you can follow and support them. Absolutely. Thanks so much, guys, for joining me on the panel. You've all been great. And thanks so much for tuning in, everyone at home. Have a great evening and see you. Goodbye.